Okay, for the past week, February 21st to 24th, these are the things that we worked on. We had a snow day in there, which messed things up. We also did some laser cutting, but that will be for a separate video. So I'm going to go back to our Onshape document and go. So where we last left off, we had created this um, assembly. And so what I want to go over now is adding items. So down below, there's a plus sign and you get the applications. So if you go to the App Store, one of the apps that we use is called MKCAD, MKCAD. And MKCAD is a library that a robotics team has put together of different parts, and it's just fantastic. Because I've already subscribed, you can see I don't have the option, but if you haven't subscribed, you'll have get the app and you click it and it is free, doesn't cost you anything. And once you're done subscribing, I encourage people to log out of it Onshape and log back in, because that forces it to load. Sometimes it might take a moment the first time it loads up, and that's okay. So in the assembly, I should now see my little MKCAD inserter. And if I click that, you can see I get my different objects that I can insert when that loads. There we go. So the first time you load it up, you might just have the favorites. Just wait for a few moments and everything will load up. It appears I may need to edit the video here. Okay, there we go. So there's my gearboxes. So I'm just going to add a gearbox, and just for sake of argument, we're using the Rev Ultraplanetary. So if you're having trouble finding something, you can always do the search, Rev space U, and there's the Ultraplanetary. So this is a Rev gearbox. We're going to stick with the Neo 550. We'll do 2 stages, and we'll make sure that the output shaft is 1/2-inch hex output. So this is just a gearbox. Let's say I wanted to have a wheel attached to the frame, then I could use this gearbox. And later on, we'll go over why you would pick different gearboxes and things. So here is my ultraplanetary, and you'll notice I like to rotate it so that it's a little bit easier to see. So I've just rotated it 90 degrees using the triad manipulator. And there we go. Now, this is going to be a little tricky to mate. Looking at the wires, I want to have them kind of facing up. So I'm going to use my fasten mate. So M is the keyboard shortcut, and always try to use the keyboard shortcuts. I often click the wrong button, and the mate connectors are easy. So you'll notice I'm going to zoom in, and I'm selecting the center of this square tubing, and I'm looking at the red, green, and blue arrows or lines coming out of the mate connector so that I can make sure that my click is correct. Now, the problem with this is that I've got these curved surfaces, so I'll have a weird setup. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to zoom to the bottom, and I'm going to select that mate right there. So it's a flat surface. I'm just zooming out so you can see. So I've gone to the bottom, zoomed in, found that flat surface, and the blue, green, and red, everything looks good. So if I do do that, there we go. I've got my gearbox. Now, the problem is mounting this. This is going to be a little tricky to mount if it's hanging over like that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use some information. So this is the face that I want to have flush with the face of the square tubing. And when I click both of them, I can see how far apart they are. So it's this big, long decimal number. And I'm just going to right click and copy that. if I go back into the fasten mate, you can see I can make some changes. And one of the changes I'm going to make is the offset. So if I look at this, you can see the y-axis is where it's moving from. So I'm going to enter that number in. And what it's going to do is it's going to shift it. Now, sometimes you need to use a negative value depending on the orientation, but you'll see these are now perfectly parallel. And just because of computer processing, you get some weird, really, really small number, but it's basically, it is 0. So this looks good. I've got my item nicely centered, and I'm just going to orient it with the front. Yes, the wires are at an angle. That sometimes confuses people. And you can see this is centered. So something to look at, if this is not centered, then that means when you inserted your item, and I'm just going to demonstrate with a new assembly just so that you understand, because it's a little confusing. So when I'm inserting a rectangle, if I use the default, it comes in exactly where I want it. But if you move around, then you're going to be offset. That is not centered anymore. You can see it's definitely not center, it's off center. So you want to be really careful when you're inserting things, because as you're inserting, if I just keep my mouse in here and green check mark, then it's positioned exactly the way it is, and that's perfectly centered, so that's great. So I'm just going to delete that and go back to my rectangle. Okay, so I've got my gearbox and everything, and what I want to do is I want to find a way to secure this, because I can't just place it there. I've got to find a way to lock it in place. So I'm going to create a part studio in context, and there's the button right there. Remember, you can always use search, create part studio in context, and you select the origin and the green check mark. So here is my part. And what I want to do here is I am going to create a sketch, and I like angling my view just a little bit so I can kind of see stuff. So I'm going to create a sketch, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to use, so the letter U, I'm going to use geometry from this gearbox. So one of the things is that there's a line right here at the top. I'll just click that line, and these circles, and when you hold your mouse over the circle, when you get the little dot, that means that you can select it. And so these are the circles that I will be able to mount. I'll be able to put a screw through. So I'm creating a gusset that will have holes in those positions. So there is my circles, and I'm going to just select the bottom of that, and there we go. Now, use the line tool and to normalize my view. And what I'm doing is I'm just going to click a straight line. You'll notice I'm looking for that right angle, so that looks perfect. And there's my line. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use something called a tangent arc. So a tangent arc means that it will be a curve, and it will be tangent to this line. And I'm just going to demonstrate some different arcs. So here's an arc right there. So you can see that's a weird little, there's a weird little thing there. That's not what I want at all. So with tangent, I want it to kind of flow from there. So I really like using tangent. So basically I select the line, I click it, I click that point, and now you see how it bends and it's kind of attached to that line. There we go. So the tangent arc flows from there. Now I want this arc to be tangent to this line as well. So the letter T is my tangent tool. And when you're creating arcs and curves and stuff, if you make them tangent to lines, things will look really nice. So that's kind of what I'm going for here. And I've got my tangent arc. What I'm going to do is I'm now going to mirror. So the mirror tool, I'm going to use this plane, and because it's all centered, I can then click my arc and my line, and now I've got a shape that is going to be my gusset. Now I can extrude this. I do like getting in the habit of naming things because it makes it a little easier to remember. Whoops. And a short form when you're in a sketch is to you can go straight into the extrude, which is really handy. So new item, 1/8 of an inch deep. There we go. Now the problem with this, I've got my mounting holes, but I don't have a hole for the shaft. So let's go back in there. And this is the other point, is that you can go back into different sketches. So it's like, oh, I want to. So instead of adding a new sketch and having an extrude, if I'm adding another hole, well, all I need to do is go back into that original sketch, and I don't need to do those multiple steps. So I'm going to create a construction, and I'm going to use that line right there. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the offset tool. So the offset tool allows me to, and notice I've turned off construction. I can create a circle that's offset from that circle, and I click, and I'm going to just type 0.01. So I don't want something very big, but just a little bit bigger so things fit nice and smooth. And there we go. So I've got my hole. I've got my gusset. And there we go. Now, I'm not going into gusset design because this is a lot wider than it really needs to be, but for it's the techniques that I'm trying to focus on here. So I've got my part, I'm going to insert it, and part one, I'll have to name it later on. So there's my gusset. I'm just going to move it over. And the reason I'm going to move it over is I'm going to mate it. So again, the letter M for your fasten mate. And I'm going to use that mounting hole. So click. I find zooming out, holding my mouse on the hole that I want to mate it to, and then zooming in allows me to select the back of it. And I just find that's much easier than trying to rotate my view to get it. So there is my fasten mate, and my part is there. Now, obviously, I'm missing some holes. So I'm going to go back into that. And a couple tricks. Now, one way I can edit in context, and it's already got the context that I was in before, so I could choose that. The other way, when you're in the sketch, if you just open up the sketch, you'll see this little assembly context, and you can select whatever assembly context you've used to be able to get the geometry. So I'm going to go back into Sketch Gusset, and I'm going to create a hole, and I'm going to use the origin to find my center point, click, move my mouse, click, and we try to standardize for number 10 bolts, which are 13/64. And the dimension tool, the letter D, click, click, and then that is going to be 0.5 inches. So there's our center hole. Now we can do a linear pattern. And if I select that center hole, there's my pattern. It automatically goes this direction. I'm going to want to space them out every 1/2 inch. And there's enough room for 4 of them. So there we go. So I've got those holes, and again, the mirror tool. And this use of these tools allows me to create things very quickly. And you'll notice what I'm doing is I'm just clicking and dragging, and everything that I've was in within my rectangle gets selected, so I can quickly select a whole bunch of things. And because I'm still in that one sketch, there's my holes, everything's good. So if I go back to the assembly, my part has been adjusted. I'll want to add holes to the square tubing because what am I drilling into? So if I right click the square tubing, um, I can edit in context, and that allows me to see the gusset. So if I select that face and do a sketch, just N to normalize my view, and I should be able to select you. And the same thing, I'm just clicking and dragging everything that is within my rectangle should get selected. So there's all my circles. Um, and then I can just go right into, let's name it first, motor mounting holes. Let's go right into our extrude. And I'm going to just select remove through all. And just like that, I've got my holes. I go back to the assembly. There we go. Now you see it's in the other square tubing as well because that's the same. I like keeping things symmetrical. I just find it easier. So there's my tool. And remember from the other day, I should be able to select insert standard content. So I've selected the face, insert standard content, and the inch. So these are bolts and screws, socket head screws, socket head cap screw, number 1032, and 1.5 inches. So we've got 1.125 inches. That should give us plenty of space. I should be able to just click insert. Now, here's the problem. You'll notice everything there's a hole. So I'm just going to cancel that. And that's the unfortunate thing. So to get this, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go through and click these circles. So by selecting the face, it selected every single hole there. So I'm going to go insert standard content, and now I should be able to insert. And because I've selected those circles, only the bolts go there. So that's perfect. On the right, that's where I need to select. And instead of bolts and screws, it's nuts, machine screw nuts, hex machine screw nuts, 1032, and insert. And there we go. I've got that. Now, the problem, now remember, you can right click, hide all mate connectors. The problem is that I don't have a way to mount this so that it will actually stay attached. So the website, Rev Robotics, if you go to Rev Robotics and just Google it, you saw that the part was from Rev. You can search for the word ultra, and that brings up the ultraplanetary gearbox. And if you click here, you can go to the drawing. And so here's the drawing. So on page 2 of the drawing, you can see they have the M3, and I'll just zoom in there so it's a little easier to see. M3 point times 0.5 and this little symbol. So this information tells us that this takes an M3 bolt. 1032 is an imperial sized bolt, inches, and M3 means it's a metric bolt. So the 3 indicates it's a 3 millimeter diameter, and the 0.5 is your threads, what kind of threads you have. So M3 times 0.5, and it's 7 millimeters. And really important, convert 7 millimeters to inches. And that is 0.27 inches. And we know that we've got, um, so 0.27 inches. We know that we're dealing with 1/8 thick gusset. So that's 0.125 of an inch. So that's 3.175. And then, sorry, I had just 7 millimeters. Okay, so 7 millimeters, and then add 3 millimeters. I'm looking for something just under 10 millimeters. What this means is that you don't want to go any deeper than that, because then the screw goes into the coils of the motor, And we don't want that because that will short out the motor and cause it to not turn. So I want something that is under 10 millimeters. Now, same strategy from before. I just click my circles, and this is where panning by holding your scroll wheel is really useful. And also rotating your view with your right. Okay, so there we go. Insert standard content. Instead of ANSI inch, I want DIN because that's the metric equivalent. Bolts and screws, socket head screws, hex socket head cap screw, and then M3. And you'll notice with M3, 10 millimeters or 8 millimeters. So I'll go with the smaller because 10 is just a little too long for what I need. So if I click insert there they are. And you'll notice I do not need any nuts at all because this is threaded. Um, so I can thread it right in and that will allow me to mount it. So I think I've covered everything. That was this entire week's worth of work. And we now have been able to create an entire structure. Um, if you go through all of the different items, we've been able to create custom parts. We've been able to insert parts that a company provides, and we've been able to get everything positioned just the way we want it. Last week we did the exploded views drawing, so all of those recordings are there. Take the time to go over them.